In this edition of Impact, the continuing allure of drive-in theaters.
You pack a car full of kids and the family or your girlfriend or your boyfriend or whatever and go see a movie. The car was your own little world.
And then, a visit to the Society for Creative Anachronism.
40 years ago was a costume party, and it invited all of the Tolkien fans who wanted to figure themselves elves and dwarves and whatnot.
But first, the return of a controversial fashion.
I actually knew a girl who did break a rib because she had just like tight-laced too into it, and somebody gave her a big bear hug at a tattoo convention.
Welcome to Impact. I'm Lata Pandya. For centuries, women have gone through great lengths to be fashionable, even if that means sacrificing comfort. In our first story, we take a look at an old-fashioned garment that's making a comeback, and in some circles, becoming a fashion must-have.
Okay, so I've loosened the laces at the back. I take the loops in my right hand.
Linda Sparks is the owner of Farthingales, a Santa Monica boutique specializing in high-end corsets. The corset, which hit its peak during the Victorian era of the late 19th century, is a stiff garment that uses vertical rods to squeeze the torso into a desired shape. After decades of being relegated to costumes and counterculture, Sparks says corsets are slowly regaining a place in mainstream fashion.
It was sort of seen as alternate fashion, whereas now it's coming mainstream. So the kids with the plaid skirts and the black lipstick and the safety pins, they were wearing corsets and building them, and they were building them out of whatever they could find. You have a wide range of women who are interested in this product. It's not just large women. Quite often we get very small women coming in, but they want curves, they want definition. So it's not about size or weight, it's about how you want to look. The hourglass figure, the hip to waist ratio, is what attracts men the most, and it's also what women find most attractive when they're looking at fashion and shape.
There are no solid numbers on how many women wear corsets, but designer Sue Nice says more women are wearing them than you might think.
It's been extremely surprising to, meet some of the people that I've met and know what they're doing under their clothes. So it's an interesting life I lead.
Corsets went out of fashion in the early 20th century, when the flat-chested flapper look became popular. Eileen Wallace, a women's history professor at California State Polytechnic in Pomona, says that this hourglass figure resurfaced after World War II, but that the corset was replaced by the girdle.
In the early 1950s, when Christian Dior comes out with what's known as the new look, that in many ways is a throwback to 1850s fashion, a very small waist and then crinolines. And of course, if you're back to the idea of a small waist, you've got to have some kind of structural garment. So I look at it as a slightly different direction. It's not actually evolved that far away from a corset.
Sue Nice says that the resurging interest in the corset can be partially attributed to one popular movie.
A kiss on the hand,
Moulin Rouge. I have to say Moulin Rouge was like huge. Everybody wanted to look like somebody in Moulin Rouge when that movie came out. That one movie was like, everybody, get a corset. Something bright.
Through movies like Moulin Rouge, corsets have also become associated with burlesque. And, says Eileen Wallace, corsets have been revived by the lingerie industry, but not for everyday use.
I don't think most people today think of corsets as a functional thing. They're something you wear because they're titillating, or you wear them on Halloween, or you wear them as part of your bridal lingerie. So I think they've become much more explicitly sexual.
This hypersexualized image of the corset is something Linda Sparks says she is constantly fighting.
When I started this shop, we had various people come in looking for fetish wear. And they all assumed that being a corset shop, we would be about fetish. And that's been sort of something I've had to fight. It's just corsets and fetish have been tied together for many, many years. And I'm trying to get people to see corsets as something else.
Today's corsets are close to those of the Victorian era, but Professor Wallace says that the use of clothing to manipulate one's figure goes back much further.
I see it beginning to appear really in the 15th and 16th centuries. If you look, for example, at what people like Queen Elizabeth I wore, you see that clothing is becoming very stiff and very upright, and that's because they're actually putting structure into the clothes, usually in the form of whalebone.
Wallace says that while the corset has existed since the Renaissance, the shape that the corset creates has changed dramatically over the years.
In the early 19th century, if you think about, for example, the Jane Austen period, people are wearing corsets, but they are much softer corsets. If you think of Jane Austen films, that really what corsets are worn for is to lift the bosom. That's what people want, not necessarily to whittle the waist down. But by the time you get to the 1830s and the 40s, what is now becoming fashionable is that tiny waist.
Ooh! Just hold on and suck in.
If you think of Gone with the Wind. What's fashionable during the Civil War period is an extremely small waist, so that's a very tight corset, and then of course a hoop skirt, so basically enormous hips. By the time you get to the 1880s, what's fashionable is a bustle. So you've dropped the hoop skirt altogether, you're still wearing a very tight corset, but now you actually have this wire cage, more or less, that fits over your backside. And then of course by the time you get about to the year 1900, which is only about 20 years later, what becomes popular is what's known as the S shape. So sort of your chest is thrust outward and your rear is thrust back, and then the corset is there to kind of bend you into that shape. And so that's, in the space of about 50 years, you have three very dramatically different visions of what a woman's body is supposed to look like, and you have the underwear adapting rather accordingly to that.
Although corsets were uncomfortable, and in many cases were laced so tightly they caused women to faint, Eileen Wallace says that women embraced the corset for generations.
I think a lot of it has to do with this idea of controlling women, and this idea that women need to be subdued, they need to be quiet, and they need to look a certain way. That womanly ideals all seem to go along hand in hand with wearing a corset.
Health problems were common among corset-wearing women in the Victorian era, and Sue Nice says the modern corset still has the potential to cause harm if it is laced too tightly.
There is a certain amount of pressure that can go on a rib, and then that pressure is there. Any additional pressure is more pressure. I've actually had people, I actually knew a girl who did break a rib because she had just like tight-laced too into it, and somebody gave her a big bear hug at a tattoo convention. So this is why you really, if your ribs are suffering, if you're having any pain in your ribs, if you can't breathe, anything like that, please loosen it up.
Despite the dangers, Sparks argues that corsets are much less drastic than the plastic surgery undertaken by many modern women.
We all want to look as good as we can look, and when we think we look good, we feel better. And if getting a waist without any damage or risk makes you feel better about yourself, then that's a pretty remarkable thing. I think it's a whole lot better than going under a knife, personally.
I sort of think of it as now we're into internal corsetry. In other words, now we expect through diet and exercise to alter the body in a certain way. And I think that's been true really since the 80s, since the introduction of aerobics. Increasingly women are told, alter your body, but alter it from the inside out. But I think what's been happening lately, particularly in the 2000s, if you look at sales of things like Spanx, I think what's finally happening is women are realizing that you can only alter the body so far through diet and exercise. There's some shapes that naturally your body is not going to conform to. And so now I think in some ways we're moving back towards shapewear, as they call it today, to make it a little more palatable, precisely for that reason.